Hey everyone, it's another beautiful day in Banff and surroundings. I'm on a beautiful walk today along the Bowman River in Dead Man's Flats. Hey, it's Rick, and I wanted to thank you for joining me on this Inwyt Walkabout. I wanted to talk a little bit today about essentially a continuation of what we've been talking about in the past with regard to words, how much we use words and the information behind it to identify things that we see or that we hear in our surroundings, how we have an interpretive component to words, immediately put some sort of a judgment or shade of opinion, conclusion around what we see, a determination, a subjective determination, and then how we sort of combine both of those things to create an image of the composite that becomes our guiding visual, if you will, for how we see things. And I want to share with you now just sort of an extension of that and take a look at the worldviews that sit behind the words and sit behind what we look at and experience, and how powerful it is, and how, if we're not aware of what we're doing, it can actually be very damaging at times in profound ways. So I have a story to share with you about my parents, who both were basically young teenagers, early adolescents during World War II, so a long time ago. And they happened to be on the wrong side of each other's backgrounds, if you will. My father was Dutch, part of the Allies, and my mother is German, and of course was on the Axis side, part of Nazi Germany. And when the war ended, it took some time for them to find their way and, reestablish, what we'll call normalcy post-war. They both went into medicine in their own, particular areas, and ultimately their paths converged with a fellowship that they were both doing in pediatrics and children's medicine. And as they got to know each other, they fell in love and decided to get married. So for them, their past differences had very little relevance to the relationship that they had created and to what they foresaw as their future together. But for one of my father's aunts, my great aunt, this was a horrifying situation for her, because my dad was falling in love with the enemy in her mind. And, even though this was probably over 15 or 20 years after the war when they finally got married, she just couldn't wrap her head around that. And essentially, in spite of the close relationship that she and my father had, she essentially disowned him and refused to acknowledge the wedding, and certainly did not want to have anything to do with my mother. And so, I'm sure my father was certainly disappointed, and I think that they were both accustomed to, the tensions that their relationship might create by, again, being on opposite sides from the past, but it didn't matter. And they knew what they wanted, and they continued with their lives together. And it wasn't probably until about another 10 years or 15 years after that where his aunt, my great aunt, ultimately started to recognize that this relationship that they both had was authentic, and that it wasn't going to change. That she started maybe to see through some of the biases and prejudices and experiences that had so impacted her and were being applied to this relationship, where she ultimately was able to slowly let go, and over a period again of years was able to reestablish connections and really develop strong friendships that went far beyond, that initial resistance and refusal. So, again, what's the point? Well, the point is that, our worldviews are always shaped by past experiences. And we're always looking at things when we identify and interpret through comparisons to things that have happened in the past. And we don't necessarily realize that we're doing that. And we're also certainly not necessarily aware of how impactful and damaging that approach can be to relationships and to how we see things. If you think about, everyday context, whether it's just very basic things, again, about having certain opinions about food, music, everyday activities, or you start to look at all of the conflict that exists, again, in the world, think about national conflicts, again, Ukraine and Russia, Israel and Gaza, you can see how those experiences, and again, not judging them to be good or bad, they're horrible situations where people's lives are forever changed. But how, if one can't distance oneself or start to see the context of what has happened, not absolutely having to influence what is currently happening and how you show up, you get stuck. And then things persist and you can't move on. And we just keep repeating the same pattern over and over again in all that we do. So I think what I would leave you with to consider today is, again, just an awareness of how worldviews, how we view and essentially do comparisons to whatever's going on in front of us or what potentially could happen, always in reference to our worldview, which is always past experience, its memories, its past knowledge, and its subjective interpretations that, if we're not careful, will always get in the way of, again, actually seeing what's going on and actually giving us opportunities to look at things as they are and to see things in a new way. And we get caught. And that catch is, again, conflict that is always there, that we're always frustrated by, but we just always seem to accept because we don't see the relationship of the worldviews that we have relative to what's actually going on. And again, it doesn't mean that you just block them out, but you put them in context. And if you start to see and start to, again, just question what you're actually using to identify, interpret, and imagine, where that source of information is coming from, where that input is coming from, you have an opportunity to just step back and say, all right, what's really going on here? Is it that, or is it something that I'm just, again, overlaying on top of what actually is going on? And what you may find is that what you think is going on is really what's not actually going on. And it creates the opening for you to maybe look at things in a new way. So that's it for today. Our worldviews are very powerful. They're always in the past, and we're always bringing them into the present and projecting them into the future. And if we're not careful, we get stuck with what we have already done, and we just keep repeating it over and over with different context and different scenarios. So I leave you with another beautiful picture here of the Bow River. Here's my path, sort of along the woods. I hope you all have a great day today, and I look forward to the next Inwyt Walkabout. I'm Rick, and see you next time. Take care.